an emotional and touching story of redemption and hope, where a chance encounter on a snowy Christmas night changes two lives forever. The snow fell slowly and silently, covering the streets of New York with a white blanket that couldn't entirely mask the decay of some of the city's outer neighborhoods. Ethan Graves walked briskly, his expensive overcoat doing little to shield him from the biting wind cutting through 7th Avenue. He adjusted his scarf, trying to ignore the Christmas lights strung across storefronts. To him, Christmas was just a bitter reminder of what he had lost. Rachel, his younger sister, who had died alone in an alley much like the one he now avoided looking at. Ethan shoved his hands into his pockets and quickened his pace. He had just left a dinner with investors, where the atmosphere had been as cold as the night outside. His accomplishments as a real estate investor were many, but none seemed capable of filling the void Rachel had left behind. He always wondered, if he had answered her calls, listened to her cries for help, would she still be alive? These thoughts haunted him, especially at Christmas. As he turned a corner toward an almost deserted square, he stopped abruptly. Something had caught his attention. Under the dim glow of a street lamp, a figure was huddled against the wall of a building. A woman, barely covered by a dirty blanket, was trembling as she clutched something close to her chest. It looked like a broken bottle. Beside her, a small empty coffee cup rested on the dirty snow. Ethan felt a pang in his chest. She looked like Rachel. He froze for a moment, staring at the woman. Her face was pale and marked by the cold, her lips cracked and her eyes half open, as if she were struggling to stay conscious. It was impossible not to think of the last time he had seen Rachel. A missed call on his phone, and a police officer telling him they had found her in an alley with a syringe at her side. "I can't go through this again," he whispered to himself. Without thinking further, Ethan crossed the street. As he got closer, the strong smell of alcohol and something else, maybe medication, hit him, but he didn't back away. Kneeling in front of her, he spoke, his voice low and deep. "Hey, are you okay?" The woman opened her eyes slowly. She looked confused, scared, but instinctively tried to pull away. "Leave me alone," she murmured, barely audible. Ethan glanced around, noting how empty the street was. He pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed emergency services. "I need help. There's a woman here. She seems to be in hypothermia and might have taken something. We're at..." He gave the address before putting his phone away. "I don't need..." Her voice was sluggish. "Yes, you do." Ethan looked directly at her, noticing how her hands trembled. "What's your name?" She hesitated but eventually mumbled. "Nora." "Nora, you can't stay here. The ambulance is on its way." He took off his own coat and draped it over her shoulders, ignoring her feeble attempts to resist. She tried to push him away, her movements weak and uncoordinated. "I'm not your problem." Ethan felt a lump in his throat. It was exactly what Rachel used to say before she disappeared. He spoke more softly this time. "Maybe you're not, but I want to help anyway." A few minutes later, the ambulance arrived. The paramedics checked Nora, lifting her carefully onto a stretcher. She looked at Ethan with a mix of anger and confusion but said nothing more. As they placed her inside the ambulance, one of the paramedics asked, "Are you a relative of hers?" Ethan shook his head. "No, just someone who happened to be in the right place." He watched as the ambulance drove away, its red lights flashing against the snow. For a moment, he stood motionless on the sidewalk, feeling the icy wind. He should have felt relieved for helping, but all he could feel was the same suffocating pain as always. Rachel might have been an inevitable loss, but perhaps this time, he could do something different. Adjusting his scarf, he looked in the direction where the ambulance had disappeared and murmured to himself, "I won't leave her alone." The following morning was cold and silent, with the first rays of sunlight reflecting off the snow piled up on New York streets. Ethan arrived at the public hospital, holding a hot cup of coffee in one hand and a paper bag in the other. He had spent the night awake, unable to shake the unsettling feeling that Nora had stirred in him. He needed to see her. He needed to know if she was okay. At the reception desk, a nurse looked at him with a weary expression. "Are you here to visit someone?" "Nora Blake. She was brought in last night, probably in a state of hypothermia." Ethan tried to sound casual, but he could hear the tension in his own voice. The nurse checked the records. "Room 412. But just so you know, she's a bit difficult." Ethan nodded his thanks and headed upstairs. When he entered the room, he found Nora sitting on the bed, staring out the window. Despite the hospital gown and her pale face, there was a strength in her gaze, as though she was gathering the pieces of herself to face another day. "You again," she said without looking directly at him. "I brought coffee." Ethan held up the cup as a peace offering. "And something to eat. I figured breakfast here wouldn't be great." Nora chuckled dryly, a skeptical sound. "You always try to fix people's problems with food." Ethan pulled up a chair and sat beside the bed. "No. Usually I don't care about other people's problems at all. You're an exception." She eyed him, clearly suspicious. "Why? Why are you doing this?" Ethan hesitated for a moment, fighting against the lump in his throat. "Because I once knew someone like you. And I failed her." Nora frowned but didn't ask further. She took the cup of coffee and held it in her hands as if it were a small treasure, soaking in its warmth. "You think you can fix whatever happened by helping a broken woman like me?" She challenged him with her gaze. Ethan shook his head. "No, I can't fix the past. But I can try to stop it from happening again." In the days that followed, Ethan worked to earn Nora's trust. He took her to a building he was renovating in a quiet neighborhood in Brooklyn. It was a modest but functional space. He insisted that she stay there at least until New Year's, but Nora remained hesitant to accept his help. One evening, as Ethan tried to decorate a small Christmas tree with makeshift lights, Nora finally opened up about her past. "My ex destroyed me," she began, her voice low, almost a whisper. "He controlled everything. The money, my choices, even who I was allowed to see. When I tried to leave, he left me with nothing. He said that if I ever tried to start over, he'd find me. And he does. Always." Ethan listened in silence, feeling anger building inside him. "You don't have to face him alone." Nora met his gaze. "You think you can fight someone like him? He's not just a violent man. He has money, connections. And me. Have nothing." Ethan held her gaze, resolute. "Not anymore. Now you have me." On Christmas Eve, Nora's ex carried out his threat. He showed up at the building, accompanied by two men, demanding that she come with him. Nora tried to convince them to leave, but the shouting drew Ethan, who was upstairs. The confrontation was inevitable. Ethan wasn't a violent man, but his instinct to protect her took over. The fight was swift and brutal, with Ethan managing to take down one of the men while Nora, finally finding her courage, called the police. As sirens began to echo through the streets, the attackers fled, but not before leaving Ethan injured on the ground. Nora ran to him, her breathing ragged. "You're an idiot. Complete idiot." Ethan tried to smile through the pain. "Probably." A week later, the building was busier than ever. With Ethan's help, Nora obtained a restraining order against her ex-partner and began planning her recovery. She agreed to join a community program that supported women in vulnerable situations, using her experiences to help others. In the main hall of the building, now decorated with Christmas lights, Ethan found Nora hanging an ornament on a tree. "You know there's still a long road ahead, right?" he said as he approached. Nora nodded without looking at him. "I know. But for the first time in a long time, I think I can make it." Ethan smiled. "Merry Christmas, Nora." She turned to him and, for the first time, smiled back. "Merry Christmas, Ethan." The snow began to fall again, covering the city in white, but this time it felt less cold, less somber. Perhaps, for both of them, it was the beginning of something new.